There's a tree that produces edible butter from its seeds. No cows, no farm. 46% pure fat, free every spring. Tribal communities in India pressed it for 2,000 years. The British banned it in the 1700s to protect distillery tax revenue. The British are gone. The ban is not. 14 regions still enforce a restriction that was written to protect colonial profits, not people. The Mahua tree keeps growing. The seeds keep falling. A 250-year-old tax decision is still deciding who gets to eat. Not because the butter was unsafe. Tribal communities consumed it for 20 centuries without documented harm. Not because a better alternative existed. The communities that pressed Mahua seeds into cooking fat did not have access to dairy infrastructure, refrigeration, or the supply chains that butter requires. Not because the science demanded restriction. No scientific study has ever found Mahua fat dangerous for human consumption. The restriction was written in a ledger by a colonial revenue officer who needed to protect British distillery profits. That ledger entry outlasted the empire that wrote it by 78 years and is still being enforced today. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next story opens soon. The archive opens in the forests of central India 2,000 years before the British East India Company existed. In what is now the states of Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Odisha, tribal communities called Adivasi lived in forest ecosystems organized around specific trees. Not randomly distributed forest, managed forest. Communities understood which trees provided which resources across which seasons. They planted, protected, harvested, and replanted with sophistication that European observers would later call primitive because it did not look like European agriculture. At the center of the system was the Mahua tree, Maduka longifolia, a deciduous tree that grows to 20 meters in tropical and subtropical conditions. The Adivasi communities did not call it a resource. They called it the tree of life. The name is documented. The reason for the name is documented in the specific function of each part, the flowers. In late winter and early spring, the Mahua tree drops cream-colored fleshy flowers from its branches before the leaves emerge. The flowers are sweet. They contain 15 to 20% sugar by weight. Communities collected them fresh for direct consumption. They dried them for storage. They fermented them into a traditional beverage that European colonial observers documented as the primary ceremonial drink across tribal cultures of central India. One mature Mahua tree produces between 50 and 200 kilograms of flowers per season, depending on its age and growing conditions. A family with access to several mature trees had a reliable sugar and calorie source every spring before any other food crop was ready to harvest: the seeds. After flowering, the Mahua tree produces fruit. Inside the fruit are seeds containing 46% fat by weight. The fat is solid at room temperature. Tribal women extracted it by boiling the seeds, skimming the fat that rose to the surface and allowing it to solidify. The resulting product has a melting point between 38 and 42 degrees Celsius, almost identical to cocoa butter and within the range of dairy butter. It does not require refrigeration in temperatures below 38 degrees. It stores for months without spoiling. It has a smoke point higher than dairy butter, making it more stable for high-temperature cooking. The communities that produced it ate it, cooked with it, used it for lighting oil lamps, and applied it medicinally to skin conditions. The fat chemistry is worth examining in full because it explains why the cosmetic industry eventually discovered what the Adivasi communities had known for 2,000 years. Mahua fat contains approximately 40 to 50% stearic acid. Stearic acid is a saturated fatty acid that gives fats a solid texture at room temperature. It is the same compound that gives cocoa butter its characteristic snap and melt behavior. Mahua fat's stearic acid content explains why it solidifies similarly to butter and melts near body temperature, the same property that makes cocoa butter the preferred fat in chocolate manufacturing. The global cocoa butter market generates approximately $13 billion annually. A portion of that demand is met by Mahua fat, sold as illite butter, sourced from the same tribal forests where it was first developed as a food ingredient. The food application that was criminalized generates industrial revenue for the ingredient's cosmetic application. The community that developed it earns a fraction of the extraction value, the timber. Mahua wood is dense, hard, and naturally resistant to decay. It was used for construction, for tools, for the structural elements of homes that needed to survive monsoon seasons. A community with Mahua trees had building material that did not require metal tools to shape and did not require chemical treatment to resist rot. One tree. Flowers for food and ceremony, seeds for fat and cooking, wood for building. The Adivasi communities around the Mahua tree did not call it the tree of life arbitrarily. They named it what it was. Now the British arrived. The British East India Company entered India in 1600 as a trading company. By the mid-18th century, it was governing territory. By the mid-19th century, it governed most of the subcontinent. The governance required revenue. Revenue required taxation. Taxation required identifying what people consumed and charging them for consuming it. The Mahua flour fermentation was impossible to ignore. Across central India, tribal communities fermented Mahua flowers into a beverage that observers consistently documented as the most widely consumed alcohol in the region. The communities that made it had been making it for longer than any record existed. They did not purchase it from a distillery. They did not pay tax on it. They made it from a tree that grew in the forest they lived in. Before the British arrived, the forest economy of central India functioned without currency, in the way Europeans understood currency. The Adivasi communities traded in kind. They exchanged labor, produce, and goods within community systems that did not require cash. The Mahua tree sat at the center of this economy, not as a commodity, but as infrastructure. You did not buy Mahua butter. You pressed it. You did not purchase Mahua flowers. You collected them. The tree was not a product. It was a common resource maintained by the community that lived alongside it. The British revenue system required cash. To generate cash, it required taxation. To generate taxation, it required identifying what people consumed and inserting a payment requirement between the person and the consumption. The Mahua flower fermentation was the clearest target. It was universally practiced. It was culturally central, and it required no purchase from anyone. That last characteristic was the problem. The British colonial revenue system had licensed distilleries. The licensed distilleries paid tax. The licensed distilleries sold alcohol to populations that were expected to buy from them rather than produce for themselves. Populations that produced their own alcohol from a forest tree were not purchasing from licensed distilleries. They were not generating tax revenue. They were a problem. The Excise Acts began appearing in the late 18th century across British Indian provinces. Each act established that alcohol production required a license. Licenses cost money. The tribal communities that fermented Mahua flowers did not have money. They had a tree. The Excise Acts made the tree illegal, not the tree itself as a species, the act of using its flowers for fermentation. But the practical effect on communities whose entire cultural and economic system was organized around the Mahua tree was total. When the flowers became the subject of criminal prosecution, the tree became dangerous to live beside. The Indian Forest Acts compounded the problem. The Forest Act of 1865, followed by the Forest Act of 1878, reclassified forest land as government property. The tribal communities that had managed these forests for generations became trespassers. The trees they had grown, protected, and harvested for 2,000 years became government assets. The Mahua tree that the community planted, tended, and depended on was now owned by the colonial government that had arrived 200 years after the tree was planted. The combination of the Excise Acts and the Forest Acts did not eliminate Mahua use. Communities continued harvesting flowers, pressing seeds, using timber, but they did so illegally. The criminalization of a food source did not end its use. It ended the legal protection of its users. Communities that had been organized around the tree became communities organized around avoiding prosecution for using the tree. The economic system built over 2,000 years became a criminal activity overnight. The documentation of what the Forest Acts did to Adivasi communities is not disputed. It is in the colonial records. It is in the parliamentary debates that preceded the acts. It is in the reports of the Indian Forest Commission that implemented them. The commissioners who wrote those reports understood that they were reclassifying the food source and building material of millions of people as government property. They wrote about it plainly. One commission report from 1878 noted that the Forest Acts would cause significant hardship to communities dependent on forest resources, but determined that the revenue and timber supply interests of the colonial government outweighed this consideration. The hardship they predicted materialized. The revenue they sought was collected. The documentation of both facts exists in the British Library in London, accessible to any researcher who applies for access. Legal scholars who reviewed Indian forest law after independence found the Forest Acts contained no provision for recognizing pre-existing community rights. Communities that had managed forests for generations had no legal mechanism to assert ownership. The trees they had planted, the land they cultivated, the resources they developed became government property under law written for colonial revenue. The law remained, because replacing it required prioritizing dispossessed communities over government revenue interests that the colonial framework had embedded into the administrative structure. Independence from British rule arrived in 1947. The colonial legal structures did not leave with the colonizers. India inherited the Indian Penal Code, the Forest Acts, and the Excise Acts wholesale. The governments that came after independence had the authority to review and revoke colonial legislation. They revoked some of it. They maintained most of it. The Mahua excise restrictions remained in force in 14 states because the prohibition politics of independent India aligned by accident with the colonial revenue politics of British India. The communities were still criminalized. The tree was still growing. Today, the fat pressed from Mahua seeds is exported from India as a commodity ingredient. The international cosmetics industry labels it Ilipe butter on product packaging. Unilever uses it in hair care formulations. L'Oreal uses it in moisturizers. The ingredient that the Adivasi communities of central India developed as a cooking fat over 2,000 years generates revenue for European cosmetic companies that label it with an exotic alternate name and charge $50 per jar. The communities that develop the knowledge of Mahua fat extraction, who refined the pressing technique across generations, who identified the trees with the highest fat yield and selectively cultivated them across centuries, receive a small fraction of the value that the cosmetic industry extracts from the ingredient they developed. They face prosecution for fermenting the flowers. They face restriction for accessing trees on forest land that the Forest Acts still classify as government property. And the ingredient they developed generates margin for companies whose headquarters are in London and Paris. The global dairy butter market generates $240 billion per year. The Mahua tree produces fat with a comparable melting point, a higher smoke point, and no requirement for cows, farms, refrigeration, or cold chain infrastructure. The dairy industry has not lobbied against Mahua butter entering food markets in the United States or Europe. They have not needed to. The colonial restrictions that kept it as a tribal food source in India, combined with the cosmetic industry's successful reclassification of it as a luxury beauty ingredient, ensure that it does not reach cooking oil aisles in American supermarkets. The fat is safe to eat. The science is not in dispute. Mahua fat has been consumed by millions of people across central India for 20 centuries. No documented toxicity, no public health crisis attributable to it. The restriction on its production is not based on food safety. It is based on a revenue decision made by a British colonial administrator in the 18th century that has not been meaningfully reviewed since. The Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act, passed by the Indian Parliament in 2006, attempted to address some of what the Forest Acts had taken. The law recognized the rights of tribal communities to forest resources they had traditionally used. It was a significant legislative acknowledgement that the colonial dispossession had been wrong. Its implementation has been inconsistent. In many states, the Excise Act restrictions on Mahua fermentation remain in force regardless of the 2006 Act's provisions. A community can have its forest rights recognized under the 2006 law and still face prosecution under a 19th century Excise Act for fermenting the flowers of the trees those rights recognize. The colonial revenue logic and the contemporary rights framework exist simultaneously in the same forest. The tree does not move. The law shifts around it. Research with Adivasi communities in Madhya Pradesh found that over 60% of Mahua-producing communities reported that fear of Excise Act prosecution limited their use of the tree. Not the law preventing use, the fear of prosecution. A 200-year-old restriction still shapes behavior through the threat of enforcement. Communities limit their engagement with a tree their ancestors planted because the consequences of prosecution fall entirely on the community rather than on the government maintaining the restriction. Here is what exists outside the restriction. In the Indian state of Chhattisgarh, the government legalized traditional Mahua liquor production in 2019. The decision was explicitly connected to tribal rights and economic development for Adivasi communities. Within 2 years of legalization, documented economic improvement in Mahua-producing communities in the state was measurable. The tree that had been criminalized as a source of illegal alcohol became a documented economic asset when the restriction was lifted. The same tree, the same communities, one legislative decision separating criminality from economic opportunity. The seeds can be pressed into cooking fat using the same method the Adivasi communities developed. Boil the seeds, skim the fat, allow it to solidify. The resulting product stores at room temperature, cooks at higher temperatures than dairy butter, and contains oleic acid, linoleic acid, and stearic acid in proportions comparable to cocoa butter. It is not available at Walmart. It is not available at Whole Foods. It is available from specialty importers who label it Illipe butter at a price point that reflects the cosmetic industry markup rather than the food ingredient cost. The Mahua tree grows across 23 million hectares of forest in central India. Thousands of mature trees drop seeds every spring that no one collects because the community that would collect them has been navigating the legal complexity of doing so since the British Excise Acts made their relationship with the tree criminal 250 years ago. The seeds fall. The fat sits in them at 46% concentration. The dairy industry generates $240 billion selling you the version that requires a cow, a farm, a pasteurization facility, a refrigerated truck, and a replacement purchase every 2 weeks. The Adivasi communities did not invent Mahua butter extraction for a market. They invented it for the forest they lived in. The forest had a tree. The tree had seeds. The seeds had fat. The fat was food. The process was refined over generations until it sustained communities through seasons when other food sources failed. That refinement took 2,000 years. It is not replicable in a laboratory on a 10-year research budget. It is the accumulated knowledge of communities who lived with the tree long enough to understand every variation in its behavior, every optimal harvest timing, every processing step that improved yield. That knowledge is being lost. Younger generations move to cities for opportunities the restricted forest economy cannot provide. The restriction that criminalized the tree did not just take a food source. It made the food source economically unattractive. The communities leave. The knowledge leaves with them. The trees remain, dropping seeds every spring into forests where the people who knew what to do with them are increasingly absent. The 250-year-old tax decision is still holding. Subscribe to and hit the bell. The next story opens soon.